Hello everyone, greetings from India. I'm architect Shubhan Modak, co-founding editor of Sthapatya Publishers and country reporter for World Architecture Community, here today with architect Habib Khan, president of the Council of Architecture India, for an exclusive interview that's held as a part of World Architecture Community's online interview series. A brief introduction. Architect Habib Khan graduated from VNIT Nagpur and completed his masters from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in USA. Having worked in Philadelphia for some time, he returned to his country in 1990 and started his own office. He has multiple awards to his studio, including the IIA KAFF Young Architects Award in 2010 and the prestigious INT BAU Award in 2018. Fiercely committed to architecture being contextually relevant, he has been spreading the message of ecologically responsible design in his many speeches as an invited keynote speaker. He has presented at international conferences of IAPS Glasgow, Degrowth, Venice, and Budapest in 2012 and 2016. A committed academician, he also currently heads the Priyadarshini Institute of Architecture and Design in Nagpur and Lokmanya Tilak Institute of Architecture and Design Studies in Mumbai. An avid painter and a lover of poetry, he currently holds the position of President of the Council of Architecture, India. For my international audience, the word Act refers to the 1972 Architects Act of India. The word Amendment refers to the proposed changes that have been introduced by the recent Council. And it is also to be noted that all this discussion holds valid only with the hope that we will be able to get this bill passed in both the houses of the Parliament of India. Before proceeding, it is strongly suggested that you go through the document which enumerates all the proposed amendments to the 1972 Act, a link for which is attached in the text. Moving on with the interview. Welcome, sir, to this session. The questions have been segregated into a few sections to facilitate better discussion, and we will be starting with the architectural education scenario in India. The first question for you is, Clause 18 states that the Council approves the introduction of architecture courses, and I'll be wanting to give you a brief on the growth of architecture colleges in India. So if you see the last few years, in the last few decades, the growth has really been slump. However, if you see the 5 years starting from 2006 to 2010, so 2006 to 2010 we have 61 colleges, and then from 2011 to 2015 the number suddenly jumps to 213 colleges. So that's almost a fourfold increase. And then from 2016 to 2020 it has again taken a dip into 84 colleges. So you see the graph has been exponential. So if you can just give a brief on why post 2010 there has been such an exponential jump in the number of colleges.
Well, to be honest, I cannot answer that question because that is something to do with the earlier president and earlier executive committee. And if you see technically in our country, we still need, double the architect. If you go by the population and if you go by the infrastructure growth that is happening in this sector, the problem that arises in this type of calculation is that 30% of our population only needs the services of an architect, while 70-75% of the population does not indulge in architecture or architectural services per se, nor architects have ventured into rural sector, agro infrastructure, agro tourism, or welfare and betterment of the people, a large population of our country who lives in the rural sector. So that gap that happens, and that is why the spurt of colleges. But market forces determine the kind of requirement that is there in any position. And I think we should be reaching an optimal plateau where, the market forces will generate the number of architects and number of architects needed for this country.
Alright, sir. Moving on, the clause 19 of the Act states about the inspection of colleges, the criteria and the various performers. However, in recent times, there has been complaints regarding ineffective inspection as well as various internal loops that are going on in action with inspecting colleges, mostly newer colleges and private colleges. So why is the council silent on that, or what are your opinions on that?
We are not silent on that. Must have been the earlier committees would probably be silent or taking their own point of view. The inspections are actually stipulated by the Act, and that is the issue, that is the concern that we are having these days since a long time, that the institutes, whether they are private or whether they are government aided or government institutes, are unable to, fulfill the minimum standards of education that the council has prescribed. So this makes us realize two things. Number one, that the minimum standards are not minimum standards, that we need to relook at it. And the other issue is that why are we struggling? Is the financial model not correct? Is the government policy not correct? Is the policy of the council incorrect? Or we need to really look at where our education is going. So this is happening because the institutes are probably wanting to circumvent the minimum standards of education. The problem lies both with the inspectors, the problem with the inspectors and the institutes and the council and the regulatory authority. So the problem is everywhere. We're trying to circumvent our own rules, our own act, and our own parliament, for that matter, because if we violate an act or a law, that means we're violating the parliament and the law of the land. So it is both ways through. But we have now devised new method and a new what we call I shouldn't say it in a public forum, but we have worked out an option which will keep the institutes in check.
All right.
We were unable to do inspections this time because of the lockdown, but we shall be doing it as soon as the lockdown is lifted, and we will give them enough, surprises to put their house in order.
Right. So my next question was actually about surprised unannounced inspection. So that is getting back on curds, I think. So the council is
every inspection henceforth would be a surprise inspection, because we have seen what a mockery is made of the process of inspections. We know it very well. I am involved with a couple of institutions. I have been on inspections for a long time, for a long period of time, and I know how institutes circumvent inspections and how they are overlooked by the council, how they are overlooked by the inspectors, or they are not genuinely not aware of it, but the institutes per se would want to get away with the minimum standards. And we have worked out a total system, a foolproof system, where every inspection would be a surprise inspection. We don't want to. That's why I've been telling quite often that we'll surprise you, but every inspection would be a surprise inspection.
That is an absolutely lovely thing to hear. So, I mean, I'm glad. And next, there has been an exponential boom in the number of private players who are actually eager to open architecture colleges and same. So, is it an effect of liberalization, or has the private lobby finally understood that there is money to be minted in this scene? So that's why so many private. I mean, the question that I'm trying to do is, if we need more architects, if we need more capable architects, why aren't we sanctioning more SPAs in the various states, or why aren't more NITs and IITs taking up the architecture colleges? I mean, that would be better for the education scene. I mean, definitely people will prefer graduates from SPA rather than some XYZ college in some private institute, something like that. Why is it this scene, sir?
It is definitely a matter of liberalization that has happened, and first private players probably realize that this is a very good business, that they can earn good money. But I think I've been telling them since beginning, and even now I very honestly feel that a fool will only open an architecture school, or rather any private architecture school, because it's a wrong perception that a private institute earns money. It's a wrong assumption. They don't earn money. You have to put in money to run an architecture. Secondly, why does the government not open SPAs and IITs is a question that I can't answer. It's the government's policy, probably their finances, their whatever, trust areas. That's not a question that I can answer, why they are not opening more SPAs. So architectural education in our country need to have an overall overhaul and a holistic relooking at the way we are teaching architecture and the way our architects are being taught in the schools, whether they are in a government institute or a private institute. I would not comment on the IITs because I've personally not seen what is the status of it, but I have seen few SPAs and I've seen a lot of NITs, and I'm very sure of what I'm saying. The NITs specifically lack tremendous quality issues. They have tremendous quality as far as education is concerned.
Right, sir. Okay. And is the council planning on sanctioning more colleges in the future, or will there be a pause? Will there be a pause?
No,
There will be a pause.
we have made a we have made a policy on future of architectural education. We have done an extensive study, and that policy will be made public very shortly, and we will go by that policy. That policy has a lot of criteria and a lot of concerns, and if an institute addresses those concerns in a particular area, particular city, particular region, then we will think of granting. But as of now, no.
Right. That's very assuring to hear. Next, what are your comments on the exorbitant fees that are being charged by some of the colleges and the subsequent poor return of interest that's coming in? Like, architecture education has really become very expensive nowadays. What do you think about that?
Not really. Not really. Only in few schools.
Yeah.
Handful of schools you can count on your
Yes,
fingers
huh.
who are charging exorbitant fee, probably because of the brand name. But there are people who are paying them, and I'm sure the student who takes admission in the first year or the parents of that particular student are aware of the return of interest on their investment that they're doing. So it is absolutely a personal choice, and a controlled regime is not what it should be. In many states, many state governments control the fee that an institute can charge, even if it's a private institute. For example, in Maharashtra and some other states, there's a regimen of fees, and that regimen of fees is actually killing the quality of institutes and the institutes themselves. So any institute, whether it's a private institute or a government institute, they should be free to charge the fee that they would want. And as far as the return of investment is concerned, it's always a up and down graph that goes on. Sometimes the return of investment is low, sometimes it goes up. So it depends on the market, and it depends on the kind of jobs that are produced for architects in the market. And that is dependent on the economy, that is dependent on the government policies, that is dependent on the international policies. So we cannot actually comment on that, why at the moment it is low. But yes, at the moment it is low, then we have to accept.
All right. Right, sir. Okay. Coming to the point of exit exam. So, with exit exam now on cards, you have previously talked that colleges will be getting the flexibility. I mean, just the minimum standards will be implemented and colleges will have the flexibility. What are the chances that the colleges will actually try to, say, exploit this flexible situation? I mean, what prevents the college from exploiting the situation and the situational freedom? So how are you going to
No,
control that?
let us understand this. Let us understand this in the right context.
Yeah.
The government is going to implement the NEP, which is the new education policy. In the new education policy, it's a very forward-looking and a very liberalized system of education is being followed in the NEP. So we have to go through understand the NEP and go through the NEP very clearly and find out what it entails. Right now, if we look at the Council of Architecture, we are the standard setting body, we are the regulatory authority, and we are the registering authority. So we are all three put together into one body, which personally to me, if you think conceptually, is wrong. You cannot be setting standards, you cannot be regulating, and you cannot be giving licenses. And fortunately, the NEP also speaks of the same thing, where the regulation of education is going to be taken away from all the councils, all the professional councils, and it will go to a higher education regulatory authority. So council would be professional standard setting body, and the regulation of education would be done independently by an independent entity, whatever it is called,
Right.
which is a good thing. But we at the council are saying, you may have good regulation, you may have minimum regulation, you may have your own sets of regulations, this is perfectly fine. But to be called a registered architect or a chartered architect, who can sign and who can empower himself to design and plan and get authorship of that building, own the ownership of that build, of the project that he is doing, he has to have an exit exam. We're calling it an exit exam, you can call it a PE, a portal exam, a professional examination, qualifying, whatever you would name. But that examination is an examination which will entail a qualified person to become a registered or a chartered architect. Now, how that person has come, through what criteria has he come, we have to decide and we have to work. For example, you are a graduate of a particular school and you apply for the qualifying exam, the professional examination, and you don't qualify. That means the education that you have come through is not good enough, is not sufficient for you to qualify to become a registered architect. You can be an architect, you can be an employed architect, you can be in teaching probably, if the college accepts it, and you can be doing many other things, except signing and taking ownership and responsibility of a project. Right? So the institutes, what we are saying is institutes are flexible to do whatever they would want to do, you know, as long as they are satisfying the new regulatory authorities' rules and regulations. We are not worried about it. We are saying you have 5 years of education, you have 3 years of education, you are learning or you are imparting education through one teacher or 100 teachers. That is not our concern. Our concern is we are going to have a very high standard of qualifying exam which you need to pass, which will be a holistic exam based on the minimum standards of education that have been prescribed by the council, which is a professional standard setting body. So we are saying that when we will be a PSSB, a professional standard setting body, you need to have, you know, that particular bandwidth to become a qualified architect. We are not saying that we are taking away the importance from architectural education. We are not taking away the importance of any architectural school. We are not taking the importance or the need for anyone to learn through the process of 5 years or 4 years or whatever. I am also of the opinion that the architectural course should be condensed to 4 years, and 1 year of practical training under a registered architect would entail him or qualify him to appear for the professional examination. So it's a very forward-looking, and it's a very it will have huge implications on the quality of architectural profession in our country in time to come if it is implemented.
All right. So with that answer, you have probably ticked off a lot of questions off my list, as I can see. Coming to the next one. So I think this will be just a yes or no answer from you. So we are extending, the amendment proposes the extension of training from 24 weeks to 1 year whole, right? So this 1 year is supposedly going to be within the 5 years of BR course, right?
Not really. I mean, not really. What we are saying is, there is a possibility that in the new education policy, the duration of the course can be reduced to 3 or 4 years. Okay. We'll have to rehaul the whole thing. But we are saying 1 year of practical training under a registered architect is must for our professional qualifying examination, is what we are saying.
All right. So, so the various models of the education,
Yes, sir. I'll just tell you, Shubham. If you see a logic, right now the council is regulating education. Right now the council is saying what is the quality of education being imparted in an architectural school, the quantity as well as the quality. But when the regulation and the regulating authority will not be the council, right now any BR holder is a registered architect in the council. Right? Now we are saying, you look at it from a point of view of the council. When council is not regulating architectural education, then what is the guarantee that council can register a BR degree holder? We will have to be dependent on a second party, which is a higher regulating authority. So we are saying, instead of that, we definitely will mandate the the mandate. We definitely will agree to the mandate of the regulating authority. We'll also agree to the mandate of the architecture course that has happened in 4 years or 5 years or whatever the status may be. But to be a registered architect, you have to have this qualifying. So that's the logic behind it. And it's an international standard everywhere. Every country has a qualifying.
Right, sir. Okay. Moving on to a little bit different topic. So we have been talking about diversification in architectural education for some time. Say, suppose someone who wants to be a writer or someone who wants to pursue law or do something. So, what are your thoughts on that? And what is the council means? Is the council planning to do some diversification or take some steps in that regard?
Personally, I agree with what you're saying. Architecture is a diversified education and should be more horizontal and more transverse rather than vertical and watertight compartment that it is at the moment. The physics, chemistry, mathematics rule was recently, a couple of years ago, it was passed, and I had objected to that. But now that it is in force and it is gazetted, we can't do much about it. Until the act is amended and the new education policy comes in. New education policy is going to change the whole definition of how we learn architecture, not only architecture, but any other course. And it is a more lateral and a more free system based on a Western module where you earn credits and each subject has a credit. So if I am going to learn economics, I can learn economics. If I want to learn poetry, I can learn poetry. And that particular course will have certain credit which will go towards my accumulation of my credits for my degree. So that's a more horizontal and more lateral and a very progressive looking policy. So I think your concerns will be addressed when the NEP will be implemented.
All right. Okay. Coming back to the amended act. So clause 28 of the amendment states that entry of additionally recognized higher qualifications can be done in the Register of Architects, but the amendment does not provide any list of recognized qualifications. So what will be that list? More importantly, is the more importantly, sir, is the other qualifications other than A-Mark in consideration? Say someone wants to be do a master's in law, or someone wants to do an MBA or journalism or even a cooking course. So are those recognitions valid according to the council?
No, it has to be architectural allied fields. And the additional qualification that we're talking of, see, let us understand one thing. At the moment, B-Arch is the basic qualification to become a registered architect. So if we have done anything else in architecture, apart from B-Arch, which happens to be M-Arch, from a recognized institution in that statute, then you will be entered as additional qualification in your certificate.
All right. Thank you, sir. Now, coming back, with respect to the clauses 45, 2E, 2G, and 2H, which are based on the minimum standards. So, are the institutions free to introduce new subjects, new pedagogical models after conforming to the minimum standards? Are they allowed that freedom? New subjects, new procedures of teaching, like that?
So, the new NEP, when it will come in, it will change this scenario as well.
Right.
Institutes will be authorized and empowered to have access in the new NEP.
Okay, sir. Okay. So we have talked in details about the new standards or the new procedures of B-Arch education, say 4-year, 3-year. So is anything fixed right now? Is anything watertight right now, or are we still in the discussion, and that's why we don't see any details of the B-Arch course, or is it something that's reserved for the MEP and not a purview of the amended act?
They are a part of the regulations. They are a part of the regulation. That's why minimum standards of architectural education is a regulation, which is in the final stages of approval and will be rolled out from next academic year. If the NEP is rolled out also from the next academic year, then we'll have to definitely be in tune with the NEP. And the B-Arch and its governance and the minimum standards is an independent thing. That is not a part. It is a part of the Act, but it is not a part of the amendment of the.
Sure. So moving on to the very last question in the education sector, and this is something that has been personally bugging me for some time. So what are your views on students, final year students or training students outsourcing their thesis and portfolio to external agencies and getting thesis and portfolio done by say external agencies by paying a subsequent amount of money. What is the council taking note, or is there a procedure to stop this malpractice from happening? So what's the scenario regarding that?
This is the lowest point in moral conduct. Why only thesis? If you're able to pay, why not outsource it to a agency who will do your learning architecture for the 5 years? Why only thesis? So this is moral corruption, and I do not obviously subscribe to it, not as a president, but as an individual as well, as my own self, as my own values, as my own. I would never do that. You know, even if I had loads and tons of money, I would never do that, because that to me is moral corruption, and that to me is something that our society needs to really look into it. And I mean, see, if you see this, what I'm saying in a perspective, in a larger perspective, why do I need to send my 5-year-old innocent kid to school? I'll pay to an outsourcing agency, and my kid will be comfortably sleeping in my air-conditioned room. Why do I need to torture him with all the homework and all that torture of crying and going to school? Why should I not do it? Why am I doing it for thesis then in that case? How are the parents allowing it? It's moral corruption at the parental level as well. And this is, very painful. It really makes me think where our society is going to. And these are the same fellow architects who will be my colleagues in few months' time. And then they will be designing buildings, or they'll be working with architects. And what kind of buildings will they design? How will be my countrymen safe in the hands of such architects? Just think about it. Also, council is taking a view of this, quite serious view. And wherever we are coming across such instances, we are notifying the institutes. And we are also issuing notices to people who are doing this. And if they happen to be architects, we will definitely initiate professional misconduct against them of the highest severity. But the check has to be at the level of the institute. If you are an institute in a particular, in my college, and I know what your graph of growth has been, what is your intellectual level, what is your capabilities, and what is your capacities as a student, and suddenly you come up with a thesis which is, unbelievably yours. It is the institute which needs to keep a check. We at our institutes, we have encouraged other institutes also, personally, not at the council level, but personally, to institute checks at every level of thesis work that is happening. There are about 10-step check that one needs to put, and periodical intervention by the guides, by the institute at various levels of the thesis dissertation progress. And that is one way of keeping a check. If you come out with drawings which are professionally rendered and professionally made, while you are not capable of doing that, we have also said, wherever I have gone as a thesis jury, I have specifically asked for the work of that student in 6th semester, in 9th semester, or 8th semester to be shown to me, to check whether he is capable of producing the work that he has produced in the 10th semester or the final semester when he is doing the thesis. So it is basically institutes' job to keep a check and a tab on this. And most of the institutes do that. Some of the institutes also indulge in corrupt practices where they overlook this kind of thing because they are able to produce and show it to the world that their students are so good and that they give so much of good education. So that corruption is a symbiotic mutual corruption at not many places, but some places.
Definitely. Okay. So now moving on to the next segment, which is deeply about professional exam and registration. I think you have answered, or rather discussed some of it beforehand. So I'll just do a short go through. The clause 21 subclause 2 states that a board will be conducted, or a board will be made for conducting this professional exam. And my question is, what would be the composition of this board? How will these members be selected or elected? Any details on that yet?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Because we see, I mean, this is a proposal in the amendment. Now we have asked for public opinion. Now, after the public opinion, the council will discuss it, vet it, and then send it to the ministry with whatever additions, refinement, and whatever. And then the ministry will send us back. There will be discussions of to and forth. So once it is principally agreed that we need to have this, and it is accepted that we need to have a professional examination, and that is by a vital amendment to the Act, then we'll work on the modalities and the nuts and bolts. How the board would be, what will be the exam, what will be the subject of the exam, how it will be judged, where it will be conducted, what will be the money charge, what will be the outcome of it, what will be the board, and all these things will be worked out after the in principle agreement of the plan. So I cannot tell you at the moment what it would be.
All right. Okay. Another important point is that once someone qualifies this professional exam, does it give them the license of overseas practice? So Canberra Accord is something that has been in discussion lately. So suppose if I am qualifying the exam, am I able to go to the States or to UK and open my own practice and sign buildings off like that? Is that on cards?
Canberra Accord is a different thing. It is to do with accreditation.
Okay.
The issue of reciprocal arrangement, like you are a registered architect after the exit exam or professional exam, and you are an Indian registered architect, so you can go and practice in the US or any other country where we'll have a reciprocal arrangement. Right now, we cannot have a reciprocal arrangement because these countries who have a professional examination, they want that we should also have a professional examination because they say it's not paritable level. No, it's not an equitable platform where we are sitting, because a mere education, a mere degree entails you to be a registered architect, while in their countries, education does not entail them to be a registered architect. They have to qualify the professional examination and the standards that the regulatory authority has set there. So the moment we are able to do that, then you'll be free. And I'm sure we will enter into reciprocal arrangement with most of the countries.
Okay. Not just fresher architects or those who are not registered, but also those who are already practicing, has a Council of Architecture license, they will also be needing to take the exam in order to be eligible for this?
No, if you're a graduate, if you're an architect who's a graduate from a particular institute, you will be fit enough to be employed in a private architectural firm or a corporate or anywhere else. You can work, but if you want to design your own building and take the ownership of the building, you want to sign a registered architect status, then you have to qualify this examination. And if you want to do a practice elsewhere, you have to obviously qualify this examination for the reciprocal arrangement.
Right. But what I'm trying to know is that suppose there are many architects in the country who are already registered, and they already have firms, they are working. So like you see with most of our bosses with whom we work, our generation works. So suppose someone who is already into the practice, will he need to again come back and give this exam for being, say, re-registered or being eligible for practice overseas or something like that? Do they need to give this exam?
If you want to practice overseas, then definitely you'll have to take this exam. We'll have to work out a via media. There's a bone of contention. There might be an architect who is practicing more than 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and we're asking him to take an exam, which a fresh graduate is also taking. So we need to work out some paritable means where probably, I won't call some exemptions, but some way out or some policy will have to be made to, work this thing out of the existing architects. That will have to be thought, and discussions will have to be done, and consensus will have to be made about it. But the license to practice or license started and registered architect status will not be a permanent one. You'll have to have continuing education programs and collect points, and then go forward as you move in life. So this is the thing which we need to discuss actually. There are a lot of other issues apart from this with the examination which needs to be discussed and right there. But like I told you, after it is in principle approved, then we can work on it.
Right. So
we will work on it.
Sure. And another question that I personally had, which is bugging me for some time. So, what are these chances that normal people, or say architects or non-architects, how can means there's a tendency to look at the business side of everything in this country. So my viewpoint is that this exit exam will again become a business opportunity. Say coaching centers will open up for training people on these exit exams, and books for exit exam or professional examination on architects will turn up. So in your opinion, what do you think? Is this a valid business, or should this be happening, or uh, is it good or bad, or what's your stand on that?
See, this is bound to happen. That you can't stop. No regulatory authority, no government is able to stop nor should stop, because this is everyone's right to have a business on whatever they would think is right. When you can have coaching classes for NATA, which is an aptitude test, which tests the aptitude of a student, it's not an entrance examination. There's a big difference between an aptitude test and an entrance test. But still we have coaching classes, still people go to coaching classes, we have books on NATA, and I mean, which is fine. I mean, if someone wants to go and test the aptitude and get, value addition in your aptitude, then you can't help that. I'm sure this will become a new business opportunity for a lot of people. There will be books, there will be guides, there will be coaching classes for it, and there might be exploitation by the architects as well. There's a possibility that you might not be paid for 1 year that you're training under. There's a possibility that, practicing architects or a registered architect will try to use the authority that he has with his registered signature. These are all pitfalls of systems. And it is also pertinent to note at this stage that anything that you arrive at, let's say you test something, you have an examination for something, you have a check for something, and there will be counter checks too. So it's a part of the process, and only the regulatory authority or the authority which is conducting this examination and has to be one step ahead of all these people.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I don't know if you have realized we have done changes in the NATA this time.
Yes.
As compared to last year. So we're trying to be one up on them. So you preempt a little, but not much.
Sure. Okay. The next question is, suppose students from a particular institute aren't being able to qualify this professional exam repeatedly. Say, for 2-3 years, you're saying particular institute is lagging, students are lagging. So who takes the responsibility there? Is it the institute's fault, or is it the student's fault, or is it the office in which they're doing the training? Whose fault is it? Who is at the helm of it?
That's a very intelligent question. I was waiting that you will ask sometime. If students from a particular institute are unable to qualify repeatedly in the examination, the institute will close down in some time. Who would want to go there? That means indirectly that the quality of education of that institute needs to be upgraded. Unless the institute will upgrade in the quality of education that it is imparting, it will not survive. It will be survival of the fittest. Architects per se will not be responsible for this, because it's a 1-year training and you have learned 4 years earlier or 3 years earlier, So the responsibility and the onus of this lies on the institute rather than the architect. Because the moment you start putting the onus on the architects will stop giving appointments and stop signing certificates. It is the onus, because see, let us understand one thing. A lot of people opposed to what I'm saying do not agree with what I'm saying. They object to me comparing an architectural graduate to a product. But I don't mind saying it again and again. It is the institute which is producing a product, let's say. I mean, you take it in whatever way you would want, whatever name you would want to give. But an institute is producing a product in the market, which is to be bought and which is to sell. You cannot make a phone, a mobile phone, or a refrigerator or a washing machine which will not sell in the market. Right? So the market forces have actually determined what is the quality of product that we will sell. Similarly, pardon my simile, but you have to produce architects which will be fit enough for the architectural practice, which should be fit enough for architects to employ you as employees, as junior architects in your office. It is the institute's moral responsibility to produce fit and learned architects who will be absorbed by the practicing architects willingly, rather than at the moment they are complaining that बच्चे को कुछ भी नहीं आता है, the student doesn't know anything, that doesn't even know how to make working drawing. It is the failure of the institute, not the architects. So if from a particular institute you're not qualifying repeatedly in the qualifying examination, so fault may lie with the student, fault the student's aptitude, may lie with the teaching that he has got at the institute, and it'll close down if it doesn't rectify itself. So in a way, it will give rise to quality education indirectly. Provided the examination itself doesn't degrade to a level where corrupt practices will come in. If the professional examinations standard is maintained, very high moral ground is set, and high aptitude level is set, then I'm sure that will be a marker of architectural education in the country.
That's very assuring. So it gives me much joy that despite the fact that colleges are getting some freedom in introducing new models, or they have to conform to minimum standards, they are being held responsible. Because what I feel is that the degradation in architectural education primarily has happened because of irresponsible institutes coming in place. So yes, so moving on to clause 25B and 25C. These are the clauses that are talking about registration of unqualified individuals as architects. Okay, so in one of the previous webinars, Sapna ma'am had said that in 1969 in a meeting, it was stated that protection of the right to practice architecture will lead to a loss of livelihoods for many. So I don't think that 50 years later, standing today, this statement is still valid. So and it has also been said that clause 25B is indeed a dead clause. So what's the council stand? So no more, so unqualified professionals are no more being given the permission to practice, or they will no more be allowed practice. Is that it? So if it's a
no, actually you're mixing a couple of things together. I think I'll try to put it into the right perspective. That debate, Sapna Madam, whatever she had referred to, was the debate prior to the passing of the Act, the parliamentary debate, the Rajya Sabha debate, the Lok Sabha debates, in which the engineering lobby had said very clearly that, if you define architecture services, livelihood of many engineers would be excluded from practice. But we have to understand that in 1969 and 1972, the nature of architectural practice was different. And it was not as watertight as it is at the moment, because an engineer used to do a lot of work which an architect was supposed to do. An architect used to do a lot of work which an engineering was supposed to do. But now, as architectural practices have become more and more complex, I am sure if you're a young architect and making a house, you will not dare make a structural design of a house. You will employ a structural engineer to do the structural design, however small a house is. And similarly, as the level of complexity of the projects keep on increasing, and the complexity sets in, you need more and more consultants who are doing specific work, and they have their roles defined in the project. The role of the architect is also now defined more and more clearly. I wouldn't say it's a watertight compartment, but it has been clearly marked as to what the role of an architect is. So the issue that comes up now is most of the consultants are engineers, so their livelihood is anyway protected. So if we are able to define and not exclude, we are not excluding any other consultant from the architectural service or from the practice of architecture, or building a process of building. We are not excluding any engineers from that. We are only saying we will only define what is an architect service. What is the role of an architect? So we are only defining architectural service now that the process of definition is very clear, and the role of our co-consultants, who are our engineers, is also pretty clearly defined. So that is why the definition of architectural services is coming in, and that debate is kind of 50 years old. So things change, and things have changed in our profession. And also the dead clause that you're talking about, it was about something to do with when an act is passed, right? When a rule when a law is passed, when a law comes into existence, there are so many cases who are prior to that law, who can be excluded from that law. So this clause that you're talking of, which is a dead clause, pertains to giving registration to all those people who are non-qualified diploma in architecture or degree in architecture, but were practicing in were doing architectural practice and had so-and-so experience, should also be given registration. So that clause is dead now, because that act is already implemented.
Okay. So if it's a dead clause, why not remove it totally?
No, it cannot be removed because it's an
Okay.
act.
Right. Right. Okay. Another question that I have is, what about those very few select individuals who are not architects, but they are actually doing brilliant work on the ground, say in certain areas such as vernacular practices or in the interiors, in the heartlands of the country? Because I personally know two, three people who are not architects per se, but their sense of space, their sense of construction is much better than many of the architects that I've met. So, what about those specific few exceptionally good individuals? What is the council planning to do, or are they allowed to practice? What is your take on it?
My personal thought in that is that we should have exception for such talented and brilliant individuals. But since it's a very subjective matter means who is a brilliant individual, who is a talented individual, who is doing good work, because good work is subjective. You may like a good work, I may not like that good work. I may say, no, it's all bullshit, I don't like it. So that's very subjective. Good work, brilliant work, or a brilliant intellectual oriented individual, who is not architect but is doing better architectural work than other architects put together, is a subjective thing. So we need to be very careful in this. But I think we need to work out a framework, policy, which will give exceptions to such people, where we are able to define what brilliance is or what good work is. So we need to have a framework for that. But yes, we should not exclude such people. I am aware of so many more people who are doing exceptional work as per my standards, but someone can question that exceptional work. But I think we should definitely look into it.
Right. Right, okay. Coming to the last question in this professional examination and registration portion. So, the amendments in the clause 37(1)(a) states that only a registered architect is entitled to provide architectural services, and that no separate registrations from local governing bodies are needed. Further, also the clause 37(c) states that no local body can give license to any architect that is already registered with the Council of Architecture. So, are these two clauses specifically put in place to finally stop this rampant license raj from municipality or other local bodies? Number one. And also, is this finally a step towards protection of the practice of architecture in itself?
It was, see, clause 37 which has created the trouble in the Supreme Court as well and the High Courts earlier, because only the title and style is protected and not the practice of architecture. Now we are filing an appeal the Supreme Court to relook at this judgment and consider these points, whatever points we're listing out. So what do you mean by style of architect? What is meant by style? What is meant by title? I mean, we are asking them to relook into the whole thing, which I hope the Honorable Supreme Court will consider it and accept our appeal. And simultaneously, we are also telling the government to amend this and incorporate services into the whole thing. Definitely, yes, it is. Even at the moment, if any municipal authority, Nagar Parishad or Zilla Parishad or any other authority are not empowered to re-register or charge or issue licenses, they are not allowed to. There have been a lot of complaints coming up regarding this earlier as well and now also, and we've been writing to them, we've been talking to them, and whenever we have written to them and talked to them, they have agreed to the whole process of not asking architects to re-register and give a new license and take money for registration. We have received complaints recently, some northeast states. We're looking into it also.
Yeah.
But this problem would be addressed. We are making a professional committee which will go into all the states. We are making state-level professional committees coordinated by the member nominee from that state, and so on and on. We're trying to address these issues, and the amendment definitely will reinforce that particular.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the practice of architecture now, this is a question that I've wanted to ask you for some time. So, what do you feel? Should architects have an exclusive right to the practice of architecture, or should the profession be protected, or should it be open? What are your thoughts on it?
No, I need to answer that diplomatically. Of course, see, I mean, let us understand one thing very clearly. and our community most of the time does not understand. Any act of a government is made to protect the common citizens, the people. So basically, we are custodian of an act, and the act is made wherein we are supposed to protect the common people from fraudulent practices of architects. To tell people who is an architect, who is a qualified architect, who is not a qualified architect, and what are the services expected out of an architect. So basically, it is for the people, for the common man to know what an architect does, how much does he charge, what is his qualification, and so on and so on. That is why the council. But we take it as it is our protection and our, benefit, which is fine. I mean, it's a mutual symbiotic relationship. But yes, architectural practice in today's complex world needs to be protected, and people also need to know that if they are entrusting millions of rupees, crores of rupees to an architect to do a project of their own, that man better be qualified and better be registered as an architect, so that the ownership and the authority of that project rests with the architect. The responsibility also rests with the architect. So yes, it is important to define architectural services. Yes. But anyone can practice architecture if you would want to. See who stops you? If you think conceptually, if you are a client, right? Can I stop you from not making your own house?
No, honestly, no.
I cannot. You can make your own house, but can I stop you also from not operating on your own self?
You can give me a brief on why I should not, but it's upon me to listen to you or not.
Right. If you're going for a heart surgery, if there's some problem with your heart, you probably cannot operate on it yourself. You have to go to a qualified doctor to do it.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But if there's a small cut, probably you will not go to a doctor.
Yes.
Right? Probably you will put a band-aid there or put some bandage and put some ointment and get it treated yourself. Same logic if you see. If you are doing a project, let's say a huge campus involving few crores of rupees, you will not probably go to a non-architect. You will go to a qualified person who will deliver that project. But probably if you're making a 2-room house, probably you think, I'll be able to make it, I'll do it. Why should I pay an architect? So it's a very complex situation. But architectural services need to be defined, and unless they're defined, the problems that we're facing will not be addressed.
Agreed to. Now, coming to another burning issue of the professional fees. So the council has a recommended chart of professional fees, and as said in the act, it's a recommendation and not a mandate to be followed. So what happens is that during bidding for projects in a competitive bid, offices are actually compromising on fees. So why is quoting less than the recommended minimum not a breach of professional conduct? Like, is it not unfair competition, and is it not restricting the total amount of money that should have entered the fraternity, architecture fraternity, but due to this unfair competition, reducing of fees, it's actually much less money is entering into the market? And is it not some, say, kind of offensive or malpractice according to the council? What are your thoughts on it? Why is this happening?
Fee shall always be recommendatory. It cannot be mandatory. It cannot be made mandatory. No regulatory authority in the world can do it, has been doing it, and nor can the council do it. In our country, it amounts to MRTP, monopolies and restrictive trade practices, freedom of, charging. The fee, again, is governed by the market sources and the brand value that you have and the brand value that you develop and the services that you give. It has a two-way effect. Like you're saying, if I make it mandatory, then a client will have to pay that much of fee, irrespective of the kind of services that are being delivered by the architect. I am delivering that kind of services, yet I feel as an architect that my demand is so and so. let us say if the fee stipulated in a particular, if the council has stipulated, let's say, a fee of 5% for a particular nature of project with so and so services, quality of services to be rendered, and you pay 5%. I say I am doing that 5%. I am giving those services and I am entitled to 5%. But me, as an architect, I am bringing a lot of value addition to the project. I am more creative and I am a better architect than someone else, XYZ. And I want to charge 10%. I want to charge double. Then again, it will be a problem. People will not pay. So this kind of, is a catch-22 situation, which usually any regulatory authority should not get into. You can get a fountain pen for 20 rupees, 25 rupees, and you can get the same fountain pen for 50,000 rupees. Now it is up to you to decide a particular brand to buy, or your capacity to buy, or the kind of product and the kind of product that you like, that you want to pay to buy. So same thing is applicable in practice. If someone wants to go to an architect who wants to charge 10% for a project, you are welcome to do. If you want to charge 1% for the same project, you are welcome. You will get what you pay, is what the understanding in the society is and should be there. Now coming to professional misconduct, the problem lies within us, within our fraternity and our community. Many people will not be happy in what I am saying, but the problem of undercutting and underquoting is a problem of our fraternity. It's not a problem of the client or the government. Let us say we complain these days that a particular organization is only giving 0.5% of fee, is only saying 1% is the maximum fee that they will pay. The problem is why we as fraternity of architects are accepting job at 0.5%. Why can we not collectively refuse to do a job at 0.5%? Why can we say we as architects will not do the job at 0.5%? Right? The moment all of us are united and start saying this, the client will be forced to pay you whatever you would want. But someone from us who is either in need of the job financially or otherwise will go and accept and undercut you. Isn't it?
Yes.
And these people are actually spoiling our profession. And the problem does not lie with the client, problem lies with our fraternity, our own selves. So unless and until we stay united and say that this is the kind of money that we'll charge for a particular project, the client also knows that he has to pay an architect this much, because no architect will accept a job lower than this standard. So what we are doing is we are working very extensively, very diligently on a manual of architectural services like the NBC, where we will say these are the ideal services. This is the ideal contract that one needs to enter into. These are the ideal services. These are the ideal drawings that one needs to make. And when an architect is fulfilling all these services that he is willing to give, then he is entitled to get paid 5% or 10% or 1% or whatever that percent. But we as architects cannot have our cake, eat it, splash it all over. We would demand a certain amount of fee collectively when we are able to give this kind of service. This is the standard of service that I am giving. So that manual should be ready shortly, and it will be a game changer, because we are saying every information of every working drawing that can be issued or that should be issued, and it has having every detail, right from the information that goes into reading the drawing, what should be the scale of a layout drawing, what should be the scale of a brickwork drawing, how is the plaster to be, and everything will be there in that manual, and that will set standards for architectural practice, and that will govern so and so fees will be a recommended fee. But it cannot be mandatory.
That's brilliant to hear. So the way I say it, there are going to be, say, sliding changes or humongous changes, and many new things are going to come in place.
I hope so.
Yes, sir. Coming to this important debate, mostly about, say, government projects, not much about private projects. So is the age-old clause of lowest bidder wins the project actually harming the entire ecosystem? So this lowest bidding thing
It
is
was there.
coming.
It has lot of reforms have come into the system. It's a QCBS system where technical weightage is about 80% and the financial bid is about 20%. So if you are technically qualified and you are able to earn a lot of score in the 80% of the technical part of the thing, then even if your quote is higher, you can still get the project. I mean, government is doing a lot of reforms. They've accepted reforms, and we have also accepted a lot of things. But we are working on it in making it 90-10, or changing the system of procurement of architectural services or engagement of architectural services. The more respectable word to call it, engagement of an architectural service.
Right.
So we are working on that. There are a lot of roadblocks into it and a lot of checkpoints. We have to talk to Ministry of Finance, we have to talk to Ministry of Commerce, we have to talk to CVC, and other concerned Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs to discuss this issue. We have initiated a debate at all the levels, but I am the work is slow on that front because of many other things, not in our control. But we are working on that, and I'm sure we'll be able to rationalize the engagement of architectural services.
Right. Okay. Moving on to the next segment is another important topic that's going on. So it's about the representation in the council. So representation has mostly been either elective or through nominations till date for all the positions. So my question is, when will the architects, or say normal architects like me or my friends, actually get to vote during the council elections? When are we going to vote for this, something like this? Is it a possibility, or like is it off the cards?
See, whatever changes you want to bring has to be through the amendment. Until the amendment to the act happens, nothing will change. Meanwhile, I personally feel that there is nothing wrong in the system. There is nothing wrong in the act as far as representation is concerned. I am sure you are aware of the constitution of the council. There are 53 members and one architect from every state, which constitutes about 30-35. Then you have 5 elected members from the teachers' constituency, heads of the teachers' constituency, and 5 members from the IIA. Now, if the IIA has not done its job well, it is not the fault of the council or the act. Meaning, there are about 18,000, 20,000 odd members of the IIA. And in good standing, probably 12,000, 13,000 members out of the 1 lakh registered architects in the country. So when this question arose, when the act was being debated, when the bill was being debated and the act was formulated, was that academia was represented through the heads of the institution. It's very objective, very clear, right? So if you have so many heads, you elect 5 amongst yourself and send it to the council. That is your representation. How will the practicing architects be represented? And they said, okay, you have a professional institute, which is the IIA. So members of the IIA can represent the professionals, right? Now it is a different issue that every graduating architect is not a member of the IIA. So the IIA needs to introspect and the members need to introspect. Why? Why can you not increase? I say to the IIA openly that why can you not increase your membership to 1 lakh registered architects? Every registered architect has to be a member of the IIA, isn't it? Now, it is a different matter that the people registering as architects do not want to be members of the IIA because probably IIA has not been able to garner that membership or the respect that is needed that you become members of the IIA. So that is the drawback and the loophole in the whole system. Now you imagine those who are not members of the IIA, practicing architects, how will they vote? What will be that exercise? It will be exercise of a national election, and it will bring a lot of corruption. It will bring in a lot of malified practices. It will bring a lot of money being put into elections, and the sanctity of the council would be lost. So the easiest part is to, my request to the IIA office bearers is to raise the standard of the institute so much that people want to become members, architects want to become members, increase the membership, increase the base, and also the architects who are not members of the IIA to become members of the IIA, and then have your say in the council, right? That's the easiest way. The other part is the states usually, the act very clearly says one architect from each state nominated by the state government. Some states like Maharashtra, Daman, and Gujarat have nominated architects. I mean, I am a nominee, I'm a private architect, but a nominee in the Maharashtra state. So some states do that, some states don't. So it depends on the state and the, you know, the political establishment there, the chief minister or the secretaries there too. But if you are able to pressurize the government and pressurize the secretaries, the bureaucracy in your state to nominate a very well-known architect on the council, things will change.
Right, sir. Yes, so that actually answers another of my question, wherein the topic was the representation of the working architects in the council. So that is actually onus of the IIA, and very rightly answered.
I would say, because
yes.
at the moment it is mentioned so. At the moment it is mentioned so that it's the IIA representation. But this is all good to talk. You know, it's all good to discuss. Some people will be happy on what I say. The IIA will probably take offense to what I have just said. But all these are talks. But when it comes to actual implementation, no practicing architect will come forward. It's my challenge. And I'm giving an open challenge. Why I'm telling you? Recently, we did a survey. It's on their website. Every architect has been mailed individually to the mail that has been registered, where we said, we want to know you better. Where we have asked 10 questions, in which we are saying, what are you doing? What is your current email? What is your address? What is your phone number? You know, whether your children are practicing architects, whether they're into the same profession, so and so. A lot of questions we've asked. And we wanted to garner latest data from our fraternity for various reasons, for various policies that we are making, to get information from you. There were certain questions asked, which would have probably, given a guideline to the policies that we are making for the benefit of our own profession. Out of 1,15,000 so-called registered architects, 5,300 have responded in the last 2 months, which I think is a very sad situation.
Only 5,300. Only
5,342 was the last count. Probably a few more would have come in, but in a matter of 2 months, out of the 1 lakh active registered architects, we get response only from 5,300. So I mean, that is the kind of attitude that we have towards all. And then you are criticizing the council, you are shouting at the council, you are abusing the council at the drop of a hat. But when it comes to you, when the ball is in your court, you don't want to respond, you don't want to be proactive. So if we make a policy based on our wisdom and what we think is right, and you will object and you will stand against it, you will, you will abuse the council in the social media, you will write so many things about the president and the executive committee. And then when we say, what have you done and what have you contributed, you have no answer, because I have my figures with me. So it's a situation that every architect needs to look into your own selves, your own hearts, as to what you're doing for the council.
Definitely,
so
sir.
I am not sure, answering your question, I'm not sure whether the architects will cooperate in election. It's very good and very ideal to talk that you will elect the president directly or you will have a say in the council. But when it will come to actual, I'm sure there'll be hundreds of people who will hand over their ballots or give their email passwords to vote whoever they would want to vote. I mean, the same practices would, I'm sorry, but I mean, that will happen.
Understandable, sir.
The present system is much better.
Understandable, yeah. Things are getting interesting, definitely. My next question to you is, and this is actually a generous concern, means because I have been talking about young architects for some time now, all their concerns and everything, so I have been voicing my own doubts. Why isn't there much representation, or rather any representation, of young architects, say below 30, 32 in the council or in some form? So who takes care of the concerns of young architects? Why isn't the council actually doing something to get them on board, or anything other, like not maybe in the committee, something? Why isn't it there?
No, see, to me, all architects are architects. The concerns of a young architect are different than the concerns of a senior architect. Agreed. There's no doubt about it. Because the the nature of practice has changed. The situation has changed. The societal situation and the economical situation, the economy and the everything has changed when a young architect has just started his practice. When I started my practice 30 years ago, 40 years ago, situation has changed. So the concerns have changed, the issues have changed. Now, what happens is, it's very easy to say that why I do not involve a young architect, or why a young architect is not involved in the process of the council. A young architect is struggling to establish his practice. He is concerned more about establishing his practice and contributing to any other cause than his own practice, not financial contribution, time contribution, and application of mind becomes a little problem for him, because it's a genuine concern that he is trying to establish his foothold in the industry. He's establishing his practice in the industry. So it becomes a little difficult for him to devote time, him or her, to devote time to any other activity apart from his concerns of his practice. That's number one. But there are many young architects who are willing to do that, and they are most welcome. In fact, you are probably not aware, that's why you're saying this. The COA Social that we have started very recently consists of all young architects. All architects who are not even 30.
Yeah, I'm aware.
They're in the committee, they're in the think tank.
Right, okay.
They're in the think tank. And we are also formulating a young architect committee under the, we are also formulating a young architects committee under the professional subcommittee that we have for issues being listed and being taken care of specifically for young.
That's very good.
In the social committee, we have all young architects, 30, 35. Most of them are 30, 35, who are working very efficiently, very diligently, and very committedly for the COA social cause.
Agreeable. We are actually a diligent and committed generation of people, and we do love the profession very much, to be very true. Now, moving on, you have talked about previously about nodal subcommittees in the council. So, are these nodal subcommittees on regional level, or like the MCI or BCI, if every individual state will have its subcommittees? So, is it regional or is it state-wise?
One thing I will continue with what I said earlier. Whatever we are doing at the council, as a policy, changes that we're trying to bring in, understand one thing, that it is for you. It is for your generation. Our generation, how many years are left, but you have entire life to live as an architect and to practice as an architect. So whatever we are doing, it is basically for the benefit of the younger generation and the next generation to come. The other nodal subcommittees, I believe in decentralization. Now, decentralization need not mean that I have offices across the country or in every state or region. Decentralization can happen in a lot of intelligent ways. And one such way is that we are going to have a nodal committee in every state. Okay. Now, this nodal committee will be consisting or will be coordinated by the representative of that state on the council. Now, wherever in a state, let us say the state of Maharashtra, which is a very big state and has the largest number of architects practicing, or any other state, Telangana, Andhra, Karnataka. Now, there may be, so to say, 5 or 6 concentrated architectural circles, if you want to call it, where there are a substantial number of architects practicing, more than 100, more than 200, architects practicing in a city. We will create a center there. Not a physical center, but having a nominee from that place on the committee who will be responsible for coordinating the work and the problems and the issues that happen in that particular city. So let's say that committee, the nodal committee, will definitely be coordinated by the nominee of that state on the council. Then we may have a nominee from the IIA, we may have a nominee from the academia, we may have a nominee from the practicing architects, we may have a young architect there. We have a young architect there, so we have about 6 people in that committee. Now, if there are, let's say, 3 architectural circles, if there are 10 architectural circles, so every circle will be represented by an architect in that committee. We have worked that framework out, and probably, by July end, we should be rolling it out and implementing it. So your concerns, we will come to know of the local concerns and every nook and corner of the country through this system. and they will be all these state committees, which is consisting. State committees will consist of all those architectural circles representatives, and then the addressed problems will be addressed by the nominee of that state. So that nominee is also accountable because he has been nominated by the government. So he has reach in the government, either whether he's an employed architect or a practicing architect. Since he has been nominated by the state government, he has reached there, bureaucratic reach or political reach. So he can address those problems there. If he is unable to address, we will provide him whatever support we can from the state. So we will have 30-35 committees working, including union territories, working in the country. They will be reporting to a professional subcommittee who will work under the executive. So this structure we have made, and it would have been rolled out by now had the lockdown not happened. But we will do it by July. We should do it July.
Right. So it feels very happy that so much work is going on at the council level, and finally states will be getting their own councils or subcommittees and representatives. Moving on, the amendment drive that we are having right now, the whole buzz about it is almost, say, 20-30 years overdue. And once, if passed, if this amendment is passed, probably will be in place for the next 30-40 years or more. So what are your thoughts? So should this amendment be more comprehensive, more inclusive, and more detailed than it is at present, what the council has rolled out? Or is the current version, say, somehow effective to manage the scene for the next 40-50 years? Should it be more comprehensive, or is it as it is?
Amendment to an act is not an easy job because of the process involved, because of the procedure involved, and because of the necessity. So the act has to be so intelligently written, and our act is quite very well written, except few issues which arise due to the outdatedness of or I should say positively, due to the changing scenarios of education, of profession in these last 50 years. Except the definition of architectural services, why it was excluded, there is reason given to it in the preamble, there's reason given to it in the debates. It's a different issue. But I think minimal changes in the act should be the thought process. And I don't see any specific reason as to why the act should be amended so soon. We are arriving at an amendment 50 years down the line, 48 years down the line, because probably of the reason that the nature of architectural practice has changed drastically since 72. Else there was no need for amendment in the act. And there is no limit that since it is happening 48 years from now, we should be prepared for the next 25 years. The next 50 years. Act can be amended day after also, after it is amended today. So there is no written rule as far as that. But the wisdom in which the act is amended or act is written has to be acknowledged and has to be appreciated. And it should not be trampled upon to such an extent that, you say your act was all bullshit and now we are going to write it again. So that doesn't happen usually. And if you read the act very carefully, and if you read the act precisely, you will understand that it's a very well written act and it takes care of so many other things. The rules and regulations which actually implement the act can be, worked upon at the ministerial level, at the council level. They're easy to amend and easy to, rather than an act itself. So I think the act is pretty comprehensive, and the amendments that we are suggesting are also pretty comprehensive. And I don't see any reason that it needs to be amended so soon. If the government agrees to amend it now, it's an uphill task. But if they agree to amend it now, Parliament accepts it, it'll be a great thing for the profession. But I don't think it needs to be amended so soon. But if there's a need, we can definitely go for amendments as soon as we think there's a need.
Sure. The last question from this council portion, and it's pretty odd question. I don't think you have come across this one before. So with respect to the clause 42A of the amendment, which states that the council will no longer be required to pay taxes to the government. So was the council paying taxes earlier, or was it not, and it plans to stop now? So what's the scene? Why isn't the council? Is there any legal trouble, or like?
There's none. There's none. I mean, I don't know why this controversy has come up, why the issue is being brought up. I don't understand the reason why. There's no need for all this. There's no need for this discussion.
Okay. Sure, no worries. Moving on, so this is the next section is about standardization of the architecture industry, or rather centralization. So has the council ever thought about a single standardization or organization of the entire construction industry by introducing something like a central regulatory framework or building principles, which brings about all construction and infrastructure related activity under one hood? Say something of the, say, GST level proposal, something that includes everything. So you build a house, you have to register through the portal. You build a road, it will be in the portal. Something of that scale. Has the council ever thought about it, or is it on the cards?
This is not the mandate of the council to do it. It's a regulatory authority, and it's a profession. It's not service. There's a difference between business and profession. Building a road or being a contractor is different than being an architect or a professional who delivers some kind of service. So we can't do that. I just talked about the manual of architectural services, in which we are trying to standardize all aspects of architectural practice, all aspects of architecture, just like the NBC, National Building Code. So we'll have some document to look up to and document to read and base our standards upon.
Sure. And what are your thoughts about a separate, say, Ministry of Construction and Infrastructure of the Government of India, a separate total overall thing? What are your thoughts about it? Will it be possible, or is it viable?
We have so many problems. Why do you want to add to our own problems? I am not sure if having a separate ministry would address issues, because the issues that are arising in our profession are because of our own fraternity and not because of an external agency. It's very easy to blame an external agency and saying we don't have a nodal ministry, we don't have a ministry specific to so we don't do this, government doesn't listen to us. The government will listen to you when you are powerful enough, when you are worth to be heard. You cannot demand respect. You cannot demand respect. You earn respect. You command respect. So we, unfortunately, are in the habit, we architects are unfortunately in the habit of demanding respect. We cannot demand respect. So you have to excel, you have to prove yourself and your role in the society. How many of us collectively have worked for the welfare of our country? How many of us collectively have worked for the welfare of the downtrodden, for the rural sector, for the agricultural sector? How many of us have done that? How many of us done CSR work for such kind of sectors? How many of us have proven to the society that architects are indispensable to you because we do so much, or we are involved in your lives? How many of us have done that? How many of us have left our elitist practices and actually have ventured to do such kind of work? Then how do you expect the government will recognize you? How do you expect that society will recognize you or your services as an indispensable part of their fabric? It's a two-way process. It's a two-way process. How many architects have actually come forward and spoken at a national level, or have worked dedicatedly to look after the migrant labor issues? People have been doing it individual levels here and there to whatever their capacity. Collectively, what have we done? They are an integral part of your, although you are an indirect beneficiary of that migrant contribution to your projects. But what have we done? We are working on a very, very viable fund in the future for this issue at the council also. We'll come out with it very soon. But I am asking this question to my fellow architects. What have we done to demand this? What have we done to demand an independent ministry? What have we done to, what have we contributed to the nation building process? Or, you have heard and seen of so many doctors conducting camps in tribal areas, in villages, free camps. They will do hundreds of eye operations in a day and come back. What have architects done? How many architects have collectively gone and helped build a house or build a village, a community level, or anything else? for anyone else. How many of us have done that? We have to introspect and see where we are going. We have to get out of our cocoons. We are organizing conferences, seminars, discussions, webinars, and whatnot for our own community. We are discussing with our own community. How many of us have actually gone and educated what an architect does to a society? How many of us have collectively extended a hand of support to the community and the country in need whenever it needed? These are points which we need to understand, and then we demand our own ministry, and then we say this is what we demand. There will be no need for a demand. You will be automatically given your due.
Agreed very much too, sir. Another pressing issue. When can we expect the proposal of Indian architectural services being discussed amongst and put forward to the government by the council, like for recruitment in the government agencies, or to reach the grassroots level wherein every district has its own architect, or every mahakuma tehsil has its own architect, something like the Indian administrative services? When is, or if at all, is it coming, Indian architectural services? Is anything on the cards, or are we discussing?
No. We are not discussing that. We are too minor in numbers to do that. But most of the states, architectural services are a dying cadre, which means that the architectural department in most of the states are being closed down. They no longer need the services of architects in the government. So the situation is very, very bleak and very dull at the moment, and not very bright, to be honest, as far as the government sector is concerned. And I think we are not in a situation to demand independent administrative services for architects. And frankly, because like I have just discussed you earlier, why and what we have not done, and what needs to be done to achieve that respect, and to gain that respect, and gain the most important point is the necessity of an architect. A doctor looks after the well-being of the society, which is very, very clear. What do you call that? I am forgetting that word, which is tangible. And a service provided by a doctor is very tangible. आपका हाथ टूट गया, हाथ बन गया, हाथ रिपेयर हो गया, सब हो गया, तो it's a tangible service that you do. Architects also contribute to the well-being and health of the nation, of the society, but his contribution is intangible. The kind of buildings that you design, the kind of spaces that you design is intangible, which is having an adverse effect or a positive effect on the individuals who are using it, on the users. If you design a bad building, I'm sure it affects the well-being of the user. But this is intangible contribution which the society does not recognize. It is the job of the architect and the responsibility of the architects to make aware the society of this intangible contribution. And when that happens, you will gain that respect, and you will gain indispensability in the society. And all this are byproducts of that. Independent administrative service, or whatever you're asking for, a ministry, whatever, and it will fall in place when you are indispensable to the society, and you prove yourself that you are indispensable to the society, and you contribute in this voluntarily.
Agreed to, sir. So with this, we are coming to the last portion of the interview, which is mainly on supply demand of architects and wages and labor laws, etc. There is a thing going on in this industry that there is an oversupply of architects as against a dwindling demand. Okay, and in a previous interview, you had also stated that India needs about 6,66,000 architects by 2030. So how do you justify this figure? What is the base data that has been used to arrive at this figure? And what is your opinion on this oversupply versus dwindling demand controversy that's going on in the industry?
See, those figures are ballpark figures. But at the moment, if you see the kind of restrictive practices that we have, restricted to a certain section of society, economical section of society, the demand and the supply is not in proportion at all. If the supply is there, if we have X number of architects in the country who are not finding jobs, or newer architects are being pumped into the system, we can take care of that pumping system to some extent. But we need to explore possibilities where architects can play a meaningful contribution, where they can be financially benefited as well, and explore and expand the avenues where architects can get in. There are so many government organizations where architects can either get trained as students or they can work there, they can contribute. There are so many sectors, like I told you, the agricultural sector, the rural sector, where it can be financially, mutually, symbiotically beneficial to both, where we can explore the possibility. We have explored, we have not explored so many options and avenues where an architect can get involved. We are only worried about iconicism in architecture, where we want to build glossy and sleek buildings, modern looking buildings, which is an indirect crime that you're committing on your countrymen. Or you can work for celebrities, or dream to become a Howard Rogue, or that kind of idealistic thought processes, which needs to be punctured. And the institutions can play a big role in doing this, giving a token service of documenting a rural house, or going and working on vernacular architecture as a token in some subject and in a semester is not serving the purpose. We need to be more focused. I am not advocating one particular aspect, but what I am advocating is there are so many avenues where architectural services can be needed and architects can contribute. I am not a magician or that foresight. I don't have that foresight to predict what are those, but there are avenues which need to be explored, that is for sure. And we as architects should explore these avenues, where we will have more what you call avenues where we can engage ourselves financially as well. So
Okay.
the ratio has to be worked out, that is for sure.
Okay. Okay, sir. Now a direct question. What do you think should be the wage of a fresher architect in, say, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 cities? What should be the figures? Not in an economic depressing situation like it, but in an ideal situation where work is coming and economy is standard. What should be the salary of a fresher architect who is just out of college?
What should be the salary?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I can't answer that. I can't answer that. I cannot answer that question because I don't know. I mean, see, it varies. What I am told. It varies from 5,000 to 25,000 to 30,000. So I don't know really. I can't answer that question, and there is no ballpark figure again. So it depends. So I can't answer that honestly, and I don't think there's an appropriate answer to that as well.
Agreed. Okay, sure. Another question. So, regarding man hours, working hours in the studio life, and overtime hours, what do you feel should be the optimum number of hours, working hours for an employee per week? And over on top of that, what should be the maximum limit of overtime hours that an architect should be allowed or can be allowed? The number of hours per week. What should be, what's your opinion on this? What should be it?
See, any regulatory authority cannot do that or can answer that. So I'm answering not as a president, but as a practicing architect and academician.
Yes.
Number of hours, as much as you can put in, or as much as is needed. It is but natural that you cannot work 20 hours a day or 24 hours a day. But if there is a need, project demands that you need to work 12 hours a day, you should be willing to put in 12 hours of work a day or 16 hours of work a day. Sometimes we have put 20 hours a day as well. If there's a presentation, if there's a meeting coming up, there's urgent work that needs to be done. In our office also, we have worked 20 hours a day with 3-4 hours of sleep. It demands, I mean, there's no optimum. But if you go by standard time and standard practices, then I think 8 to 10 hours is a good amount of time that one needs to work every day.
Right.
Even if you see institution, it's about 40 hours a week. In any institution, it's about 40 hours a week, assuming that it's a 5-day week, so 8 hours per day, 40 to 42 hours per week is the academic working hour load in our country. And professionally also 10 to 12 hours a day, I think is more than enough actually. But that's my personal opinion, nothing to do with the council.
Agreed too. Yes, that I understood. Now coming to really the last portions. So, exploitation is rampant in the architectural scene of India. So, irrationally low pay, extremely long hours. As I'm saying, long hours would not be that much of a problem, but extra time work without extra time pay, that's a problem. And then there have been issues of mental harassments as well as physical harassments in case of many female employees in our country. So what's the council stand? What is your personal stand? How are you or the council headed by you aiming to stop this kind of exploitation? And mainly this one is rendered at the junior level architects. So architects who are freshly graduating, they are the ones to bear the brunt of this problem. So what is the council doing? What are their thoughts on it?
Morally, like I've told you earlier, we are at the nadir of our existence. Exploitation of people who cannot retaliate is the worst, the most, cowardice to the maximum. And I'm aware of the exploitation that is happening mentally as well as physically of the young architects by the senior architects or by the professionals, practicing professionals. Our stand is, in a some kind of a personal dilemma, because we are not an investigating agency. Council is not an investigating agency. So if you are exploited and you complain to the council, what can council do? We have said that you also complain to the police, have an investigation done, and if the architect is found guilty or if the charges are proved, then we will ensure that there will be professional misconduct against him or some kind of misconduct against him. And the complaints that we are receiving, and unfortunately sometimes we are unable to assess, engage whether those complaints are correct, genuine, or are a victimization of a particular person. And the issue that our women architects are facing, our girls are facing, are immense. Let me tell you, to such an extent that we have made a women architects committee in the council. It consists of 5 or 6 people. Our vice president is heading that, and we are looking into these issues, in which we are saying what is the problem that the specific issues and problems that our women architects face, and how they can be addressed and how they can be tackled, and how we can extend a helping hand, and build capacities of these women architects to come up into profession and also look into the sexual and physical harassment complaints. We've already formed that committee and they're working on it already. But exploitation per se is again a problem, is again a problem of our own fraternity. I mean, you understand one thing, that a fresh graduate gets paid less than the driver of the office these days. And who is responsible for it? Who is responsible for it? We as architects, we senior architects are responsible for it. We want to have temporarily financial gains. And we feel that if we have not paid an architect his due, and we have negotiated the salary and paid 5,000 rupees less or 10,000 rupees less, we have earned a great amount of fortune. But without understanding that you have nailed one more nail in the coffin of the profession, the architecture profession, the coffin of the architecture profession. And I always quote one thing. I again and again blame my community and my fraternity for I mean, I am blaming the community many times, and I am exactly not blaming, but I am imploring you to think within your own selves. And unless we start putting our house in order, let us not expect someone else to come and put it in order. I always say this, कि मैं वो चराग हूँ जो आंधियों में रोशन था. मैं वो चराग हूँ जो आंधियों में रोशन था. I am that keeper, which was a light in turbulent times, in windy conditions, in a storm. खुद मेरे घर की हवा ने बुझा दिया है मुझे. I am being killed, I am being eliminated by my own people,
Yeah.
from the people of my own house. So I am telling you, and I don't mind and I don't miss my words whenever I speak, because I speak what I think is right and what I think my mind think is right. Our profession is being killed by our own people, internal. It's a termite in our own profession. And we want deliverance. We want a prophet to come and deliver ourselves. We want a Moses to come. We want a Muhammad to come and a Christ to come and deliver ourselves. There is no prophet who is going to come and deliver you as a community. We have to deliver our own selves. And that is the biggest problem that our community is facing. And that is the biggest battle that I'm fighting. Battles of amendment, battles of everything else is a very minor thing in front of this internal termite that is killing our profession. So it's my sincere request with folded hands to my own community that please do not, please think twice before every decision that you take, and let it be in the interest of our own profession. And once we start doing that, all these issues of exploitation, whether it is sexual exploitation, financial exploitation, mental harassment, and everything will go away. When we collectively say, for example, there are a group of architects in a particular city, let's say 100 architects in a particular city, and all of them decide that we'll pay, let's say 20,000 rupees to a fresher. And if someone pays 10,000 to a fresher, why can that particular person not be banned or can be ostracized from the community? We are not so united. Acha, tu 10,000 de raha hai, I will also give 10,000. I will also give 9,000 is the attitude that we have. And that is the exploitation that is happening. And that is, I am telling you, every such act is another nail in our profession's coffin. And we are not paying our younger graduates or our employees their own dues, but we expect complete dues in excess of what services we have given from our clients. And when they don't pay, then you shout, and then you go to the council, you go to court asking for your dues. But what about the dues that are due for your people who have worked on the project, or people who are working for you? Similarly, the same cases for our institutes as well. Salaries of the staff, exploitation of the staff by the management, and so on and on. Everywhere the moral degradation has happened, and we are killing our own profession.
Agreed to, sir. And let me say that the small poem that you told, it actually gave me goosebumps. In my copy, I had also written one particular statement which I did not read out, but because you touched that issue, I'll read out. So the question was, are the bosses getting greedy? I think that's a question that I've already answered. Now, I think we have only 2-3 questions left in the interview session. Another issue is that it pertains specifically to the lockdown situation. So during this lockdown, many have complained that they are not receiving salaries. In fact, many of my friends have said that they haven't received salaries from as far as March. Say this is May. Many have not received March salaries. Many have received 50% or even less. So, and as you know, most of the workforce of our generation are actually migratory architects going into other cities for working, and we don't have the opportunity of that good an economic padding so that we can fall back and take the hit for a few months. And also being working, because our parents have borne the expense for so long, we are quite hesitant in asking them for money during this situation. And this is one serious issue that's turning out to be very true right now. So if the complaints are received, will the council, because you also had issued a letter requesting architects to look after their employees, so what's your take on it? Even after that, why is it happening? Is it again the same exploitation scene that's happening?
Same exploitation scene, the same issues which I just told you a little while ago, that we need to introspect in what we're doing. We have issued an advisory against this, but it's an advisory. But let us understand one thing, that advisory in times of an emergency becomes a rule. So if people don't understand that, I mean, we are not in a, we don't want to actually crack the whip. But the issue is very serious. I personally feel that when it comes to an architectural institute or an architect, there is no reason why that you shouldn't pay the salaries, because your contribution for your employees and the architect's contribution is not on an hourly basis, on a man-hour basis. An architect, let's say, gets a fee for a project. percentage, lump sum or whatever, he gets a fee for a project. Now, if that project gets stalled for 2 months, that doesn't mean that his fee will be reduced, isn't it? That fee will be a part of the whole deal. That fee will be a part of the. Let's say, let's calculate this, that for an X amount of for an X project, you were to get an Y amount of money. Now that project gets delayed by 2 more months because of this lockdown, or 3 months by the lockdown. That doesn't mean that your Y, the fee that you're supposed to get, is getting reduced by a certain amount. That fee is fixed. Only the recovery of it has been delayed. So there is no reason why an architect should not pay their employees. Is number one. You can say, an architect can say, I have this much of buffer funds. I can pay salary for 3 months, 4 months, unless the money is recovered. It's a different issue. But not paying the salary at all is a wrong. I can go and tell my employees that I have a buffer fund of this much and I can pay you for 2 months. I can pay you for 3 months. After that, I have no money to pay. If the projects don't start, if the lockdown is not lifted, I will not pay. It's a different issue. But I'll pay you when the money comes back. There's a totally different angle. But if you say I'm not going to pay because you have not worked, it is a wrong attitude. Same as with the institution. The fees has been collected in the start of the year. And why is the faculty not being paid? There is no reason why the faculty should not be paid. Because the fee against that has been recovered in the earlier year in advance. So same thing is applicable to architectural practice as well.
Agreed to, sir. Now, I'm really taking a lot of time. The last 2 questions. So, Council has very recently introduced a link to report fake architects. And I think that's a brilliant move. So, my question is, when is a full-fledged grievance registration portal coming to action? And that is coming. And
that is coming. We are talking. See, there are 2 options that we need to. There are 2 options we're looking and exploring the fact of the grievance redressal cell, online grievance redressal cell, that we can either implement it at the council level or we can link it with the government redressal portal. We have written to the government and we are following it up with. We want that it should be linked with the council. So whatever complaints of the Council of Architecture will come will be redirected to the council. So that is underway. That should be done in. It depends on the speed with which the government will incorporate the Council of Architecture grievance redressal portal into their own. But we're talking to the NIC, and I think it should be done. And if not, then if it is taking a lot of time, then we will do it at the council independently.
Right. Okay. Now for the last question of this rather very long session, from your heart, pragmatically speaking, do you think this amendment will actually go through and we will see the light of the day? Like, what is your personal, not as the president of the council, as an architect, as someone who's been in it for so many years, what do you think? Will this go through?
Yes.
So
yes, it will go through. As a practicing architect of more than 30 years, as an academician running 2 successful institutes in the country, and now as the president, I have never done or undertaken anything which will not achieve fruition. So I am sure with the kind of approach that you all are having and the kind of awareness that has come into our profession, in our friends, architects, and the kind of involvement and the keen interest that all of us are showing, and I am sure with our collective efforts, we will be able to achieve this.
Agreed, sir. Okay. So with that, dear audience, we come to the end of this rather long meeting with Architect Habib Khan, President of Council of Architecture, India. Lot of questions answered, lot of doubts clarified, and with this, I think we will be ending the session today. So to my audience, I say stay safe, stay indoors in this situation, and I think that's it. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being with us. We hope to be in contact after this. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.